I'm delighted to be here today with David Lawrence, the author of Are We Really Biochemical Robots? And David, I'm really excited to talk about your book. I see you have it up behind you as a graphic, but here's a copy of my book. And as you can see, I've got my sticky notes in there. Primarily because I ran across a section today about midway through the book that I thought, aha, he hit one of my triggers that always gets my juices going. It got every synapse lit up today when I hit that section. So I'm eager to talk about that with you later. But before we get started, I'd like you to tell a little bit about your background, where you grew up, what it was like growing up, what attracted your interest, and what path you followed.
I grew up in LA. I was an LA kid. I went through all the basic schools.
Before you go any further, you're an LA kid. So were you sports minded or arts minded or music? What was on your path there?
I was music and arts minded. My two brothers took up the sports mantle, and that was their domain. So I took up the more creative, playing guitar, piano, and at one point even trombone. And went that kind of a route. I also was interested in philosophy and read a lot of philosophy and psychology, which eventually led to a philosophy major at UCLA.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to USC Law School, was a practicing lawyer for 25 or 30 years, and here I am now.
So what branch of law were you primarily working in?
Commercial transactions, negotiations, and contract.
I'm guessing that taught you a lot about people, how to deal with people, how people react in certain situations.
It taught me a lot about people, especially because I was under the tutelage of some very smart people who taught me how to navigate that world.
Mm-hmm.
And also it taught me a way of looking at language very carefully and dissecting language for multiple meanings and trying to tease out what's really going on. And that's a craft that all lawyers have, but I think contract and transactional lawyers are particularly training to tease out all of the nuances and be very clear when it comes to language. You don't want an unclear provision against your own interest or your client's interest in a contract. And I think it's very helpful when it comes to analyzing a topic like the present one,
Mm-hmm.
because there's just a lot of loosey-goosey language and vagueness and lack of clarity that partly comes from language that really has to be carefully sorted out.
Okay, so when you say the topic like the present one, you mean the basic topic of your book, which you didn't use in the title, but basically you're talking about free will.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
it could be for any given subject, especially one that of which it's sort of a large, general, metaphysical kind of thing that's been under dispute for 2,000 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
And what people talk about and how they use language is very important. For example, it took me the longest time. Oh, I should back up and say that after I left work, I picked up a book by Sam Harris and was fascinated by it because there was a lot of uses of language that were very unclear. And it took me a long time to tease out his arguments, what he meant by certain terms. It took more time to figure out what the book was saying and how it was structured in terms of arguments than actually writing it, if that's possible.
Well, so I'm curious about that. So when I run into a book like that, unless I have a gut feeling that it's very, very important book,
Mm-hmm.
I won't pursue it because, I mean, there's only so many hours in a day. So if somebody's not being clear, you have to wonder, are they not being clear because they don't know any better? Or are they not being clear because they're trying to be obtuse, trying to cover something up? So what caused you to pursue that book and to give it that much of your time and effort?
Well, in this case, and I understand what you're saying, in this case, it was the topic that was important. And it was a popular writer, a best-selling author who is addressing a subject that is rarely addressed. I've got a kitty here who wants to come on my lap.
Oh,
So,
is that a calico kitty?
this is a cat. No, it's a tortie kitty.
Oh,
Tortoise
okay.
shell.
Uh-huh.
I would introduce her to the viewers, but there she
Well,
is.
there she is. She's got a calico face. Calico
Yeah, she
face and
does.
a tortoise body.
Tortoise body.
Yeah.
Um, that'd be called a compatibilist in the free will trade, a little bit of both.
So you got interested in free
I hear
will
what you're
because
saying
Sam
about
Harris.
normally I would put down something that I felt wasn't really thought out or didn't quite work or had a lot of questions or problems. In this case, it was a important subject, a major writer writing about that important subject. Me believing that maybe it was me, maybe I didn't understand it, maybe I was missing something. It was a short book, it wasn't comprehensive. That's to the credit of the book in the sense that it can't explain everything.
Now, this is Sam Harris's book with the title Free Will.
With the title Free Will.
Okay.
And so it was more the topic, more the profile that the book would have of the topic, given the pedigree of the author, that really interested me. And the third thing was that I just fundamentally, on every intuitive level, disagreed with what it said. Not just
Okay,
not just
before
the
you go down
argument.
that road, did you basically feel that way about everything about Sam Harris, or were there other things of his that you
No, it's quite the opposite. I probably agree with everything that he's ever said, except for on the subject of philosophy or free will, or he's got a book called The Moral Landscape. So in the philosophical arena, we part ways. In just about every other way, we're pretty, not every, but pretty close to in sync.
Well, I have to confess that I have not listened to Sam Harris, so I don't even know what he talks about outside of philosophy, free will, and the moral landscape, because the only introduction I ever had to Sam Harris were the debates that he did with Jordan Peterson.
Yes, yes.
I got started on this because of my interest in Jordan Peterson's work, and I have heard Sam Harris in those debates, but other than that, I don't really know anything about him. But I know that a lot of people who inhabit the little corner of the internet that I inhabit came via Sam Harris into Jordan Peterson and that left Sam Harris behind and then moved into this new arena. So
yes, that's a fair path for somebody to take. And Jordan Peterson skyrocketed at that point in time when he started dialoguing with Harris. So I did the same thing. But the subject of those topics that he duked out early on with Peterson involved meaning and truth and religion. And Harris made his mark writing a few very good books against dogmatic fundamentalist religion and the damages that are caused by it and the irrationality of it. So that was the focus of his disagreements with Peterson. He thought that I don't presume to summarize the whole thing, but in broad terms, his point of view was that these are bad ideas and ancient stories. And Peterson's view was a much more metaphorical, moral, allegorical way of looking at truth. And they originally squared off badly and had a big, blowout. You may have heard that on the original Harris podcast, and then they got over it and talked about it in more civil terms, as I'm sure Harris and he would admit. So that was the original direction that how Harris came onto the scene through his criticisms or critique of a fundamentalist religious dogma.
So, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You are on a flow there talking about Sam Harris and his book Free Will and how you were reading it and trying to cope with the language that he was using and trying to understand what was not sitting right with you.
Right. And nothing sat right with me. It's not a super organized book, but in fairness, it is a short one. You do have to really work to tease out, or I had to really understand and tease out the arguments and really get into a real topic behind some of his arguments, which involved doing some research, a fair amount of research, in which I found out that some of the things stated weren't the most accurate or most comprehensive or conscientious way of putting things to a readership that doesn't know the area, as I didn't. So this all came together and just fascinated me. Important topic, the fundamental nature of man, best-selling author, not agreeing with anything, arguments or presentation or substance of the arguments, and wanting to learn more, really, really motivated to say, wait a second, this isn't the right story. Perhaps I can see what it is.
Well, so my personal curiosity is, why do you feel that free will is important?
It's perhaps the most important question there is. I know that sounds like a bombastic claim, because it's a surrendering of authority. We are surrendering our authority to outside forces. Perhaps I should back up and give a general meaning of the term as I'm using it and how it's generally used for the audience. Determinism is the idea that everything we think and everything we do was predestined at the beginning of the universe and comes down through a causal chain of physical events. And the thoughts that I'm having now and every thought I ever had in my life was predetermined. I had nothing to do with them. I may watch them as they arise, to use a concept in free will. And everything that I do, my behavior and everything about myself was already predetermined. I have nothing to do with it. So we don't control our thoughts. We don't control our actions. They're causally mandated by physical or forces beyond our control, unknown forces, as free will often puts it. And
when you say free will, right there now, you're talking about Sam's book.
Yeah, I'm talking about what it means to believe in determinism.
Yeah. Yeah, but sometimes I noticed this in the book too. Sometimes you use free will. Because I was trying to read it carefully, you mean the book, but if I'm reading it too fast and I don't notice that it's in italics, I might think, oh, he's saying this is part of free will. You're saying this is part of Sam Harris's diatribe against free will.
Yes, I wish I could put italics when I talk, because there is that problem, and I was trying to figure out how to solve it, and italics seemed to be the only way to do it. But I have your problem. Is that a free will or a free will? But what I wanted to starting with it was defining the opposite, determinism. We are biochemical robots. Our thoughts we have nothing to do with. We don't control our actions. We have nothing to do with, we don't control. There's no aspect about our lives that are under our control. All of it is in the hands of third-party forces, unknown and mostly or all physical. And
you would say that is Sam Harris's position?
Yes, with a footnote that randomness is okay. He's let in randomness, events that don't have absolute causes in a prior state of the universe, but just happen somehow. And he makes the valid point that doesn't help free will, because we can't control what's random. That's by nature uncontrollable. It's random. So he allows some randomness. It's not 100% causes. That having been said, most of the time he talks as if it is. We go back to the causal chain to the Big Bang, and all of that was inevitable. Well, the footnote is, well, it was mostly inevitable, but there are some random currents weaving in and out at some unquantified contributional level. So that's Harris's position, and the position of basically all determinists. So when I read that, I thought and I read the arguments for that, I thought, wait a second, this isn't the whole story. It isn't the only story, and it doesn't strike me as being the correct story. And that was the investigation I embarked on. To go back to your point, why does it matter? Because and that's why I wanted to lay out determinism first. It's a surrendering of authority. We don't control our actions. They're in the hands of third-party forces. We don't control who we are. We don't really make choices. Choices are illusory. We experience making them, but that experience was also determined. and the result of unknown causes beyond our control. Most of the problems in life, in a overtly simplistic but having some truth to it way, is due to our surrendering authority, whether it's to parents, whether it's to teachers, whether it's to ideas that we accept without critical analysis. We're constantly surrendering control and putting it in the hands of things that are other than us. And I think that's a pretty bad thing. We have to do it to some degree. We don't control our bodies or physiologically or biologically, except to the extent that we can influence them. And we don't control the language we were brought up and so forth. But so we have to surrender some control to get a conceptual fundamental grasp of things. But within a huge domain of human choice, provisionally call it that, so the surrendering of control doesn't lead to very good things.
Well, yeah, I mean, it just makes me think right off the bat about how psychologists say that one of the worst things that you can do is take away another person's agency, right? Well,
or your own.
That's right. How different is it to take away another person's agency or to surrender your own agency? Basically, you're just giving up any. Jordan Peterson always talks about how any joy that we ever get in life is from making progress towards a goal that we have set in front of ourselves, a higher goal that we have set in front of ourselves. And if you don't have a goal because you have no choice, then you have no chance at joy or anything else. It seems like it paints a very nihilistic view of the world. And I can fully understand why you struggled to understand what he was saying, because if you inhabit a completely different worldview in your own mind, and then you try to step into his basically what's a nihilistic worldview, it's pretty hard to understand what a person is saying when they're talking like that.
Well, he's not a nihilist. This is the irony.
I know he says he's not.
Yeah, and
he's either a nihilist or he's a Christian in disguise, as Jordan Peterson always says.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson is one of the few of the let's call them social media pundits or new media intellectuals who endorses free will. He makes some mistakes about what the Libet tests mean in a short speech he gave once about the Libet test, or that included the Libet test, but he is a free will advocate.
The thing I always found interesting about the Libet test is, even though they use that to gravitate against free will, I listened to a really great presentation on that a few years back, and the scientist that was talking about it said, and I don't remember exactly what part of the experiment showed this, but one part of the experiment showed that even if there is no free will, there definitely is a free won't.
Those experiments have been done, yes, as subparts of but a free won't is free. I mean, it's an exercise of the will, or it's not. But that aspect has been talked about. I have a whole chapter on the Libet tests, and the bottom line is they prove absolutely nothing about everything. In fact, about anything. In fact, they prove that that determinism, that we're not neurally determined, if anything. And they're presented.
I didn't get to the chapter on Libet, so I'm looking forward to that part. So you got started there. I'm sorry I keep interrupting you because it's so interesting. Surrendering our authority. That's why if you try to take away free will, we're basically surrendering our authority or our agency or our ability, our capacity to make any sort of decisions. And it seems, as an attorney, that should be very pertinent to you when thinking about legal issues. If a person has no free will, then the devil made me do it. So how can you put me away for that,
The devil made me do it. The Twinkies made me do it. Predetermined causation made me do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My childhood trauma made me do it.
My parents made me do it.
Yeah.
Mom, if you're out there listening,
yeah,
we're surrendering authority to everything all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, pick up a can of food, right? And it says um, carrot juice, right? Now you want to look at the ingredients. Maybe it's carrot juice, maybe it's not. Some juices say they're pineapple juice, and when you look at it, it's mostly grapes. Well, we're surrendering our authority to labels and to all kinds of things. I wanted to give a trivial example of you can't believe what a label says. If you start reading labels, you won't believe any of them anymore. Some may be true, some may not be.
Well, and
Some
we
say they
accept
are
them
what they
because
are.
we accept them because we want to simplify our lives.
Mhm.
You know, you can't go down every trail, so you
No,
have to simplify, right?
but there are some basics. I mean, I'm feeding cat food to my cat,
Mm-hmm.
and a vet says, well, she has a kidney problem. You got to again, this is just a wild example. You got to feed her high protein, and this company makes special food, high protein. But when you look on the protein level, you see that it's no more than any other cat food, and that the
Mm-hmm.
ratios are exactly the same or within inches. And but you're paying more for the company that is putting out the
Mm-hmm.
special food that gives presentation to the vets and says they've done studies in this and that. Well, you can surrender authority to the fact that a vet is telling you that this is the right cat food. Now, this is a trivial example, but you know, there are huge areas of our life where we trust someone or surrender authority, where we don't question, either because we don't have time or we can't go down every road or a number of other things. We feel we're not competent in the
I
topic.
think that
We are
that point, yeah, I think
mesmerized.
that points up where that points up a very interesting thing. I don't think it's a trivial example, because the one that popped into my head when you started talking about the cat food is how everything says gluten-free now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 10,
Mm-hmm.
15 years ago, nobody even knew what gluten was and
Mm-hmm.
nobody cared. And
Mm-hmm.
somebody somehow made people care about gluten. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a very small portion of the population that can't handle gluten. And then it expanded to now everybody should be avoiding gluten. And once they make you aware of that, then they can put gluten free on anything that has nothing whatever to do with gluten. I've seen
Mm-hmm.
gluten free peanut butter.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen gluten free oatmeal. I've seen gluten free. Um,
Wait a second. They no longer put wheat in peanut butter? Since when?
I've never seen, I've seen
I
gluten
didn't know
free,
that.
I've seen gluten free hard candies. You know, they have nothing
It's
whatever to do with wheat.
a marketing device. It's just like
Exactly.
you
So
see.
they create a category for us to be worried about, and then they create products to help us not worry about it. And then
Mhm,
they don't even create the products anymore. They just add that label to other
mhm.
things to make us feel like, oh, now that's a safe product and we're going to pay twice as much for it. So
Here's the one I like. Real apples contains real cheese in the cheese. I mean, are they making a metaphysical, philosophical statement? Yeah, it's real. Okay. I would expect when I buy apple juice to have real apples, not mechanical, not robotic, not fake. I expect apples when I buy apple juice. Call me crazy. Um, I love real. I also like natural. Natural. It's natural. Uh,
mhm.
well, okay, sure it is. It's part of the cosmos. It's got molecules and atoms and quarks. It's as natural as anything else. So these things become marketing tools, and they have some magical meaning. Wow, real apples, natural ingredients. So this is all a surrendering of authority. And
Mhm.
maybe it's not trivial in the sense that it's representative of the numerous things we do in life, things where we could be taking serious control, at least in the sense of questioning and working through it and saying, is this right? How many people have gone to a doctor who's recommended something that they, for whatever fluky reason, talking to a friend or curiosity, they start exploring and they realize that the doctor didn't give the right answer or the lawyer didn't give the right answer. But if you surrender authority, you don't question that. Now, you're absolutely right. Have to choose your battles, as they say.
Mhm.
But my sense is there's a huge area in which we accept things because they're custom, because they're social, because a best-selling author wrote it. Um, because a scientist who's done a Levin test says there's a connection between prior neural impulses and decisions when there absolutely isn't one, shown on his own study. So I think surrendering of authority is huge.
Well, and it points up, earlier you were talking about how when you were growing up and when you were studying philosophy and thinking about life and in your legal studies, that language was very important to you. And I think this points up the importance of language to everything, that language is actually prior to everything, because language sets I don't know, sets a baseline. You know, one of Jordan Peterson's big arguments that he's been making for about 5 years now, and he's finally coalesced it down to where he can make the argument very briefly, which he did in his recent lecture on the Logos at Ephesus. The end point of the argument is that meaning precedes matter. And I think it's a very cogent argument, and I totally agree with him. But if meaning precedes matter, then that means language precedes matter. And that's one of the reasons why language is so very important, and that when we communicate with each other, we have to make our best effort to communicate clearly and to communicate truthfully, because that's where all the meaning is embedded. And if we get that wrong, then we get everything wrong.
Well, one of the ways of looking at that relative to the free will debate is a theory that I offer, not mine, I call it the view from nowhere theory, which is that we can look at ourselves in the third person and study our behaviors and our biology and our physiology and our genes, our genetics. And we're looking at an object out there in the world that happens to relate to consciousness, but we're taking an objective view of things. We can also study ourselves as subjects internally, ideas, flows, behavioral patterns, and all that. And yet we're still looking at something external. Let's call it objectively, in terms of mental reality, inner, and something out there, third party, objective, outer. I'm using objective just provisionally, as it's something other than what's doing the looking. And the view from nowhere argument says, wait a second, if we're biochemical robots, then we're biochemical robots following pre-programming, making the conclusion that we're biochemical robots. Now, how can biochemical robots do this? If they're robots, they're not making any kind of conclusion or about anything. They're just mouthing, their receptacles mouthing pre-programmed words and thinking pre-programmed thoughts. So they're not making any determination about anything. In fact, they can't know that they're biochemical robots if they are biochemical robots. They're just following what they're told to believe we are. It's a bit of a circular thing. And the view from nowhere argument says, look, science is objective in a sense. And this is going to dovetail into what Peterson's saying in a second. But who's performing the science? A human subject. Who's deciding what subject to study? A subject. Who's determining the procedures, investigating the facts, giving them priority, giving them meaning, to go back to a fundamental term you used. Well, a human subject, a subject of some kind, is doing that. Who's making judgments? And none of this can be done by biochemical robots. They are robots. And so determinists would say, well, this is all just experiences that are fake, illusory, that we think are real because neural circuits are firing, or any other number of causes, the state of the universe, if you span out there broadly with the concept. There is no science. In other words, the view from nowhere argument says that there has to be a subject. It presumes agency. Who chose the subject? Who's judging? Who's sorting? Who's assigning significance, priority, meaning? You can't ignore that. And scientists, the scientific outlook in general tends to not focus on that. This is all being done in consciousness. That doesn't mean it's just consciousness. And that doesn't mean that consciousness sets the rules of the game. It means that there's a serious contribution to how we look at things and how language divides things and how meaning is essential. and how the axioms of science, the assumptions of truth and knowledge and regularity and connection and our ability to know truth and all those kind of things can't be proven by science. They're the basis on which science exists.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I would relate the free will debate to what you were saying about meaning and what Peterson was saying about what's more fundamental. I don't even think you have to say which came first or which is more fundamental for purposes of the free will debate. It's just a fact that we're viewing all this through consciousness. And if we are biochemical robots, we're not making any judgments and we're not determining anything. And what we think about everything isn't a thought. It's just a pre-programmed experience.
When you describe that and you use that language, what is running through my head is, I mean, the scientists who are describing human beings that way, it sounds like there's some motivation driving that viewpoint. And it seems like a motivation of control. Now, it may be completely subconscious motivation, but why would you want to see human beings as incapable of meaningful decisions? Unless you want them to feel like they're incapable of meaningful decisions and that somebody else has to take over for them and make decisions for them. I mean, it's really creepy. When you laid that all out, when you just laid it all out there in the last like 3 or 4 minutes, it's like, wow, that's really creepy. I mean, I don't think of Sam Harris that way as being creepy, but because
I don't think
it's
creepy.
all very subtle. You know, so many of these ideas just get dribbled out to us and they don't generally get all gathered together in one lump like that and just delivered to us. This is what they're really saying. We get a little here and a little there, and well, you don't have this, and you know, you're influenced by that, and you get all these little dribbles. And so, yeah, I can accept that. It's like a frog boiling in water. You don't notice it happening. But then when you get it all in one lump sum like that, it's quite disturbing that that's the picture. And if that's the picture they're painting for our children, extremely disturbing. What kind of population is going to be generated out of that in 20 or 30 years? We were already seeing it happening, but it seems like it could invert very quickly.
Here's the thing. They don't believe it. Harris doesn't believe we're determined. No determinist believes that we're determined. I have a few paragraphs on this in the book. Nobody goes about their life as a determinist. They can't. You know, it's like try not making a decision for 5 seconds, right? Nobody lives as a determinist. Nobody believes in it. And if you think actions reflect your beliefs to some degree, there's not a single determinist on the planet. We get out of bed, we make decision after decision. Every determinist does. Every determinist assumes that they have free will and going about everything in their lives. I point out in the book that there is no determinist. I say a test, try and stop making a decision for a minute. Try and stop making a decision for a second or two. They have a conceptual structure, an intellectual idea of how the world works. And it largely comes from the scientific enterprise of looking at things objectively. And now when you look at ourselves, we become mechanical objects that can't be differentiated from insentient objects, let's say. But they don't believe it. It's a conceptual scheme by which they want to explain things. If somebody says, well, what's it all about? Do we have free will? But they don't live their lives that way. They don't choose their values based on that way. They borrow all their values from the free will paradigm. You know, somebody is judged responsible or guilty or not to the degree to which their freedom was involved in the action. That's a simplification, but it's a basic sort of categorical thing. So if somebody's insane and isn't responsible for what they did, why? Because their freedom was impinged by dysfunction and they couldn't control themselves. So all the determinists use all of these free will values, or the category of passion killing. Somebody walks in and they see this terrible betrayal by their whatever, and they go crazy, and And there's this category in the law saying if you're motivated by extreme emotion that's has a reasonable relationship to the situation, albeit to the wrong degree, to a pathological degree, there's an excuse or a mitigation in the law, because the law recognizes that one's free will is impinged when they're under the sway of extreme emotional stress or circumstances. Harris and others talk about it, determinists talk about it, but that's a free will value. The measure is the degree to which your free will is compromised or impinged. So there are no determinists, really. There are people who believe they're determinists because that's the conceptual scheme that they default to when they look at reality, and they have various reasons. They do not live their lives that way. You won't find a single determinist living their life as a determinist, except when they're asked the question.
Yes.
Which explains a lot of the cognitive dissonance I had in reading the book. Well, how can he say that our choices matter? Our choices matter, but we don't have no control over what we think or what we do, but our choices matter. So there was all this double talk that I had to sort of figure out. And all determinists that do this, especially in the area of morality and responsibility. I give some examples in the book where a physicist says, yes, our thoughts determine, a complete misreading of Levin, and then says, our thoughts 10 seconds before we think, our thoughts are already determined. And then she says, half a second later, but we've learned to develop self-control, and we hold others accountable by the degree of self-control they have. Well, wait a second. You can't have it both ways. If our thoughts are controlled by events that happened 10 seconds before, there is no such thing as self-control. How can you be talking about self-control? And every determinist who talks in the area of morality or responsibility has to do this fancy fudge, this fancy dancing. It's illogical, it's contradictory, and they don't want to bite the bullet. And it's a simple bullet. The bullet is you can't be responsible if you don't control your thoughts or actions. It's that simple. So you can imagine my confusion when I read a book by a best-selling author that says everything we do is determined, but that doesn't mean you should be resigned. That doesn't mean you have to think a given thing. You can decide to inspire yourself. Our thoughts matter. And you're going, what? What do you mean our thoughts matter?
No wonder it took you a while to work through it.
Exactly.
Better you than me. I'm glad you did the footwork.
And it's not something that's unique to Harris or his book Free Will. I'll say that his book Free Will, all the determinists do it. They all do it. There's another unnamed person, or maybe named, I don't care, a biologist who's terrific and knowledgeable and articulate and a great mind. And he talks about how I quote him in the book, we don't have free will, and everything is neurons firing, and show me the neuron that spontaneously fires that doesn't have a prior firing or a prior material condition that causes it, and then we can talk about free will. And then 2 seconds later, he says, well, we can't let murderers run around in the streets. We've got to lock them up. I mean, think about it. You have a broken car that's dangerous to people. You're not going to keep driving it on the road. You got to put it in the garage. You got to fix it. And after you sort of gulp and swallow and look around, I'm in a dream. Am I not in a dream? Didn't he just say that everything we do has to do with neurons firing? Who exactly is going to go lock up these murderers and decide whether they're guilty, and decide to take a car off the road and make the decision to fix the car or put it back? Who's doing this if we're biochemical robots? Who's doing this? Well, according to him, neurons are doing it. And yet he is counseling, he's addressing an audience that says you should take a broken car off the road and not endanger people. Well, where does that come from? Where does that
motivation?
That's just what his neurons are telling him to say and believe.
No.
Okay.
That's the motivation I was talking about, because he's the one that knows who should get their car off the road, and he's the one who knows who should be and who shouldn't be locked up. He's the one, whether it's him personally or just that he sees that there is a certain category of people who understand better and know better what should be done. I mean, the minute you start coming up with should, then you've defined the rules. You should do this, and I know that you should do this because I'm the one that has the prior knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a good magic trick is really what it is. But I wanted to ask you, one of the things that I personally find hard to understand, because I was not a philosophy major, I haven't studied philosophy. I've tried to pick up what I can here and there from the guests that I've had and the reading that I've done in order to be prepared for my guests and so forth. But you talk a lot about causation and how recent scientific, recent in the last 100 years, scientific thinking and scientific discoveries have basically knocked the pins out from under causation, and that that inevitably leads to, in your mind, if there is no causation, and if the uncertainty principle and other aspects of quantum mechanics and quantum physics are true the way we know them to be true, then free will is now possible again. That if I think what you're doing is linking causation and determinism, that the scientific belief in causation, Newtonian classical physics led to this idea of determinism. Or do you see that going back before Newton? The whole determinism, do you see those ideas going back before Newton, or are they a result of that turn in history?
Well, I think they've been in play with Aristotle and Plato in various forms, and talked about through the clerics in the Middle Ages and all. There's always
But
been
is it a different perspective on causation? What I'm trying to understand for myself is when Newton and the scientific revolution, they make a fundamental change in the way that we look at causation. Is there a role for causation in a world where people have free will? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Well, let's take the first part first. I think as a matter of history, Newton codified and made universal laws that were based on causation, which worked for 300 years and were the basis of science. And so they took upon themselves a huge authority that this is how the world worked, and it was the best known way to describe and predict how the world worked. So causation was given a huge authority under Newton's laws. In that sense, I think it took on a momentum, to use a Newtonian word, that was pretty effective and pretty strong. There has been a progressive undermining of the concept of causation over the last 100 years. Let me preface the topic by saying I don't think you have to prove that causation doesn't exist or prove that it doesn't exist in most or some or all realms of reality to argue against determinism.
Okay.
It is one.
That makes me feel better.
Let me say this. It's the premise for determinism. It's their fundamental premise. The burden's on them, as a lawyer might say, to not premise an entire philosophy on an arguable fiction or a highly doubtable concept. That's on them. They're basing a whole philosophy on it without examining it. So I believe all you have to say at minimum to undermine the foundations of determinism is to say, you better justify causation. Nobody can agree on what it means. Nobody can agree on whether it exists. And when I say nobody, I mean the greatest minds from, Greece and before the ancient Greek philosophers. Nobody has ever agreed on what it is, how it exists, whether it exists. I quote Bertrand Russell, who was writing at the beginning of the quantum revolution in 1905. 1910, in that range, and he was saying it's not relevant to science anymore. Science is about differential equations, and it's about relationships, not causes. This is a long time ago, more than a century ago. This is even before quantum theory pervaded. Quantum theory then came along and dug another hole in things, in terms of, well, let's go to relativity first. Relativity came along and said that there are conditions of the universe in which causation is impossible, in which the laws of physics are impossible. Well, what goes on? Causation isn't involved. It can't be involved. Einstein could have been wrong, and it is involved, or since he's considered one of the greatest minds, and it would be inconsistent with his theories, which are generally accepted, with limitations and footnotes and questions, at the fringes, at least, that the laws of physics and causation don't work under various circumstances. They can't work. So what's working? Well, it's not causation. That's before quantum theory came along. And quantum theory obviously introduced the probable model of the universe that everybody knows of and thinks of. In reality, based on a lot of research, a lot of quantum scientists are determinists, and some of them aren't. The main theories are sort of a split 50-50 on whether the reality is determined or not. So quantum physics doesn't provide the life raft for free will, or that it's thought popularly to do, but it did remove Newtonian impediments that prevented free will, like the causal chain. There ain't no causal chain anymore because relativity says that it's not possible under various circumstances. Quantum theory says at least some probable aspects are involved in the universe. I say some, it's actually pervasively non-causal aspects, along with causal, depending on your take on quantum physics. And the biggest indictment that comes from quantum physics is that the math works. Probabilistic equations and probabilistic math predict reality and best describe reality. Causal equations, Newtonian equations based on causation, do not predict reality. So what does that say? If causation were the base of how the universe worked, why would causal equations not describe reality as accurately as probabilistic equations? Now, that doesn't prove free will, but it proves that the concept of causation as the foundation of the universe is in serious trouble and is seriously doubtful. Based on any of those things I mentioned alone, it's doubtful, and you add them all up, and it's quite a bit. There's also, to throw into the mix, the quantum events like entanglement and so forth that are fairly well known in popular versions of quantum explanations, and probably everyone's heard of entanglement, but the idea that molecules or atoms or quarks can be connected, let's say subatomic particles, in a way that what you do over here affects galaxies away over there faster than the speed of light, violates relativity theory. There's no causal mechanism. There's no physical communication or event. There's no physical medium by which any communication could travel. And yet something over here affects, in quotes, or influences, in quotes, something over there. It ain't causation. Causation can't. So we have these, causation can't explain it. So we have a whole bunch of reasons to think that causation, assuming it can even be defined, and I go through some of the, even under contemporary schools, there's 5 or 6 schools arguing about what it means. They're all inconsistent. Nobody has any accepted definition. There's no consensus. But even if you get all past that, it's not explaining reality. That's the bottom line. The math doesn't work. Now, this is the fundamental premise on which all determinism is based, with some randomness sprinkled in for spices.
Well, while we're still here in the quantum realm, because at some point I do want to talk about the division between the quantum world, which is this highly atomized world of what Wolfgang Smith likes to call the physicalism, is the world that the physicists look at, all the little atomized bits, right? But there is another world where if you kick the can down the road, the can goes down the road. And there is a causation somehow in this world. in the world that I live in. If I kick the can down the road, if I kick my problems down the road, they're going to have a consequence on my life as well. So, I mean, there is a cause and effect that happens at this level. So at some point I want to talk about the division between the two levels and what's happening there. I'd also like to talk about, do you see a role for time in this situation where the past is concrete, we're in the now, and then the present is this world of probability? And then, but before we get there, I want to look at page 106 in your book. I'm assuming they're all the same version.
I'm actually coming out with a new version.
Oh, okay.
That's been expanded beyond Harris and has some fun pictures of robots doing things that are illustrating what's going on. And
that's great. Well, on
so
106,
that will be relevant for maybe 2 more weeks.
Okay. Well, anyway, it's
probably that's a probabilistic view of reality.
It's part 3 in your chapter called, in chapter 5, The Probable Universe. Part 3 is Stepping Stones to Freedom. And you start talking about novelty. This is where I get really generated, because one of the reasons I got so interested in Jordan Peterson was that in reading Maps of Meaning, chapter 4 is about anomaly. When you talk about this, you say randomness brings something new into the universe. It brings forth novelty and generates novel outcomes. A random event generates something that wasn't required by anything in the prior state of the universe. A random event is an anomaly. Okay. So anomalies generate something not required by anything in the prior state of the universe. So where do these random events, where do these anomalies come from? And you go on to say, nothing can explain why one possibility occurs rather than another. Novel events or anomalies emerge from the disconnect between one state of universe and the next. Their existence isn't a necessity. They emerge from nowhere. And that's the thing I've been working on for 4 or 5 years here. Because in my mind, all growth in knowledge, in wisdom, in learning, in understanding, all of that in our human world, even in the growth of information in DNA is a result of interaction with anomaly. It all comes out of anomaly. So where do the anomalies come from? And it seems to me almost as though, and this is where the woo comes in, because it often seems to me as though the anomaly is perfectly suited to the problem. The anomaly that arises has within it all of the random probabilities that are necessary to find a solution to the problem. So as an example, let's say a husband is unfaithful to his wife, and then he says, I want a divorce. She's thrown into a world that's been caused by this action that now puts her in a world of complete randomness. Every single thing that's sitting in front of her is something that was not probable before, but now there's this combinatorial explosion of probabilities out there and decisions that have to be made, and struggle and hardship and all of that. But there's also treasures hidden in that minefield. So how do you find the treasures in the minefield? I mean, obviously free will is required for that, right? But
well, something other than computer cogs and neural firings is required for that. Something other than that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But for her purposes, if she can see that in that there are treasures to be found, then she can make her way through that minefield without being completely destroyed. So if there are treasures in that minefield, then it almost seems to me as though these random events are in some sense a gift. This random field of probabilities that's out in front of us is in some sense a gift. And then if you take that back to this whole idea of attention, attention gathers all of our vision to one focal point so that we have a way to navigate our way through the field. The whole thing just seems to tie together to me to say, yes, meaning does precede matter. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on about my thoughts, but I just wanted to throw that out there and see what you think of it.
Well, they're very pertinent to the free will debate, your thoughts. Novelty broke the causal chain. Novelty is, I think, another way, a reverse or inverse, whatever the word is, a way of describing the product of random events, right? What generates them, where they come from, why they're here, why this, not that, is inexplicable. One thing you say is also true, very true, which is that they're not random events aren't entirely random, or probabilistic events aren't entirely probable. They occur within a context and a framework and a structure. So the answers, the random answers you were talking about, are occurring within a structure of events and memories and meaning and significance, and the event that happened and what it means for a husband to cheat on his wife and so forth. Mm-hmm. So all of the possibilities, the novelty to the responses is still within a context. Mm-hmm. And then when you said something, I was struck by something you said about how the possibilities that occur, I'm loosely paraphrasing, somehow can include do include the answer, so that there's a relationship between novelty and context and circumstances and the structure in which they appear. And that's clearly true. It's true in quantum physics. And I think it partly explains that relationships that you're saying. Quite interestingly, novelty breeds in a way that fuels the question that's on the table. Mm-hmm. To put it that way.
So, I wrote some notes down here in the margin, if I can read my handwriting. Oh, I don't know if you've seen any of the work that I've done about Michael Levin and his work with cells. He is a biochemist, synthetic chemist, working on regenerative medicine. I think you'd find his work very, very interesting. And he's made some very interesting discoveries about the way cells communicate with each other through bioelectric signaling. Because as it turns out, DNA gives the cells information about what proteins to build. And if you have undifferentiated cells in the blastomere, they know how to build an eye and how to build an arm, but they don't know where to build an eye and where to build an arm. So scientists have been looking for a long time trying to figure out how the cells know where to go when they're building the body to get the parts in the right place. Not only in the right place, but they know when to stop, when they know how to make bilateral things equal, and they know when to stop with the hands on either side, that they're the same length, and that, you know, they all have 5 digits. And that happens through this bioelectric signaling. They tell each other where to go. And once they get there, the way he describes it, and he's a completely materialist scientist, completely materialist. Mm-hmm. When the cells get there, they have a subroutine that kicks in that tells them how to build the eye. Well, so some of the research he's done is with tadpoles, where he and his scientific friends develop what he calls a designer tadpole, where the eyes are in the wrong place and maybe the heart is in the wrong place. But when that tadpole metamorphizes into a frog, are they going to get a messed up frog with the eyes in the wrong place and the heart in the wrong place? It turns out they don't. The frog ends up perfectly normal coming out of this messed up tadpole. The reason he did the experiment is that he thought maybe each cell had a certain distance it had to travel. So it knew, if the eye was here in the tadpole, it's going to be here in the frog, and it knows what that distance is. But if the eye is over here in the frog, but it has to get over here, obviously not a matter of distance. It's a matter of somehow those cells have some, he doesn't use this terminology, but obviously there must be some sense of form or some sense of telos or where they're heading or some quality that they're trying to achieve. So
he doesn't believe, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but he doesn't believe in the traditional Darwinian viewpoint that all of this, it comes about from mechanical accidents guided by mutations for the purpose of adaptation to an environment, and that the frog comes out all kinds of awful ways before it becomes a frog, to say loosely metaphorically. And a part of a wing pops out, and those somehow with no wings popping out end up not surviving, and all that kind of thing. So the way you're describing what he's saying, he's not agreeing with Darwinist thought. But regardless, it's the same question: is this a mechanical mechanism, or is there something novel that it implicates a purpose? Like, how do those electrical communications? Why are they even acting the way they are to give us an eye? How can they have a vision or
for me,
a
the deeper
purpose?
question is, what is that language, and where did the language come from, and how can we learn that language? So that's one of the things he's working on, is how can he learn that language? He's done a lot of work with learning how to disrupt the communication. But here's where he comes down on the evolution thing. I think he's completely an evolutionist, Darwinian evolutionist, except that there are times like this where, without any evolutionary span of time, this change can happen between the messed up frog, the messed up tadpole, and the frog in one generation, in the same generation. You have a messed up tadpole, but it becomes a perfectly normal frog. The other thing that he's done is scrape skin cells off of the adult frog, throw a bunch of these skin cells in a dish of medium, and the cells, over a very short period of time, within 48 hours, will clump together into units, and each unit will make itself into a living organism that has motility in the medium, that can take in food and send out waste, and that can gather up extra cells that are floating around and clump them together to make new units. So it's actually, he calls them xenobots. He said they're actually a new organism that's never existed before in less than 48 hours. And he says they know what to do. They know what to do in order to survive, but they have no evolutionary history. Now that's interesting, right? In 48 hours, they have no evolutionary history, and they have the same DNA as a frog. So if they were found in a pond 1,000 years from now, and scientists investigated that DNA, they would see that it's the same DNA as a frog. So something else is obviously going on.
That's the point. There's something else going on in the universe besides causation, and there's so many different ways to approach it, and so much evidence. So without getting into free will, you can ask the determinist, on what do you base this idea of a determined universe with some randomness? What's your basis for it? The math doesn't work. No agreement on the meaning. Probabilistic descriptions better define reality. Number of conditions operate where there can be no causation. Doesn't account for novelty. It doesn't account for randomness. These events that just pop from nowhere, that have no relationship except within a structure to the prior state of the universe, and didn't ever have to happen. There's no reason why they happen as opposed to another. So this is all good evidence that the central principle of determinism, causation, is highly doubtful, and it has to be established by determinists before they want to argue against free will, or before they want to use that as an argument against free will. There's others. That's a major part of the book, or one of the chapters. actually two chapters. One approaches it from conceptual point of view, that it makes no sense causation. Hume talked about that. He was the most famous guy in that area. Bertrand Russell talked about it. And then you have all the disagreements. And then there's a chapter on the science of it. You know, the impact of relativity theory, breaking free of the causal chain from Newtonian science, the quantum issues, the math, entanglement, and so forth, all of which adds up to a profile which you say the determinist, the ball's in your court. You want to base a theory on something that seems to be fictive, go ahead, but why don't you first start by justifying why it's not a fiction? Because by all indications it is. The other big argument, you haven't gotten there because of where you are in the book, but the other, I think the most compelling argument against determinism is, and you'll get there in the chapter that is called the performative contradiction, is the fact that determinism is contradictory. It drains itself of truth value. It invalidates itself. There's no determinist principle that can be phrased in a way that's logical or that doesn't violate the rules of logic. To say it simply, if everything that we believe about truth is programmed, and we think it's true not because it's true, but because of thoughts, according to the determinists, that have been, and experiences that have been implanted in us by our causal programming or unknown causal events. If that's responsible for our beliefs about all beliefs, then it includes all beliefs about what's true. And if it includes all beliefs about what's true, then it includes whether determinism is true or not. Mm-hmm. So determinism removes the concept of truth from the universe, including as to its own truth. It says it's the functional equivalent of saying truth is what you're made to believe. Now, that's an illogical statement, because if truth is what you're made to believe, then you were made to believe that truth is what you were made to believe, and there's no truth involved in something that's just hammered into you by an unknown cause. So determinism is contradictory. On the one hand, it's saying nothing is true. It's all beliefs that were pre-programmed. They were destined since 13.7 or 8 billion years ago with a Big Bang. Your thought right now about what's true has nothing to do with what's true. It has to do with how the quarks and leptons and all that stuff was banging around and cooling in the Big Bang, and as it was scattered throughout the universe. So truth's out of the equation. The surrendering of truth, another surrender in our thoughts, is putting truth in the hands of third parties. Well, you don't control what it is. You believe true what you're caused to believe. A third party controls it. That makes determinism absolutely fundamentally contradictory. It's impossible. It's something that logicians or what have you calls a performative contradiction. Statements that take away their own ability to be true or inherently contradict themselves. Mm-hmm. The famous one is, this sentence is false. The liar's paradox. This sentence is false. Well, if it's false, then it would be true that it's false. So it's true. But if it's true, then it's true that it's false. And you go around. It contradicts itself. You can't make a statement like that and be logical. Well, you can't make a statement that says all of our beliefs are causally compelled, because you're conceding that the only reason you're saying that is because it was causally compelled. It has nothing to do with the truth. It has to do with what you believe true. Because according to Harris and all of the determinists, our thoughts are causally compelled experiences. They aren't based on truth. They're based on mechanical force. That's the other sort of fundamental way of approaching is determinism, any basis on which to invalidate free will. Invalidating determinism doesn't prove that there's free will. It proves that there ain't no such thing as an argument against free will based on the premise that we're determined. If there's no truth in the universe because our thoughts are based on beliefs, I'll say it another way, how can anyone say that determinism is true? Isn't that just another belief that we were pre-programmed to believe? So
Well, I mean, the
all
people that say
determinist
there
principles.
is no truth, that's the perfect performative contradiction.
Exactly. And in fact, I use that as one of the first examples of giving sort of generalized, everything is relative. Well, that's an absolute statement. That's not relative.
Mhm.
There's no such thing as truth. Well, really? Are you telling me that's true? That's interesting. Exactly right. And that's what determinism is. It's saying there's no such thing as truth, but determinism is true. I happen to know that. Not on the basis of being compelled to believe it by mechanical forces. I know that determinism is true. Every determinist is making a false truth claim that cannot be made when they say determinism is true. Because if it's true, that nothing is based on truth. It's all causally compelled. So I have a chapter on that and go into sort of some fun things about, don't believe anyone. Then I can't believe you either, right? So I can't believe what you're saying, that I can't believe anyone. So these are all illogical statements, and determinism is fundamentally illogical.
But I keep coming back to this question: what is gained by believing that determinism is true? Every one of us that has a set of beliefs, we have some reason for that set of beliefs that we hold, because hopefully we're always listening and trying to learn and bringing in new things into our field of vision and our field of understanding, and adopting those things which work, adopting those things which seem to us to be true, adopting the things which seem to be logical to us, and we sort of build our world out of these things. And every person has a worldview. Some people get trapped in worldviews that are very static because they've been put out there into the world, like, oh, you're a leftist or you're a rightist or whatever. So, I mean, those are incomplete worldviews, but every person has some worldview that's been built up out of their own experience in life. And I would think that if we sat down and talked about it with somebody, we actually have reasons for the things that we've adopted. But somebody who makes their whole worldview determinism, which seems like a very narrow worldview, they must have something that they gain by holding that worldview.
Well, first of all, it validates the scientific enterprise, and these are mostly scientists who believe it. Not all, but it comes from
It validates a certain narrow perspective of the scientific world, right? I mean,
correct.
obviously doesn't validate quantum mechanics.
Well, some insist that it does. Some of the most prominent theories insist that it does, in the face of some very weird contradictory evidence of things that can't possibly be explained by causation. It's a little bit humorous, the ironies involved, but it does, in a general common sense way, validate Newtonian causation, which is common sense, the way we look at things by common sense. We don't look at things by probabilities, except in certain cases. But in quantum world, everything is fundamentally probable, whatever that means, and whether there's a causal substrate behind it is something different. But everything's calculated by probabilities. By the way, to go back to something you said, the quantum theory does apply to the macro world, does apply to the everyday world. And there's various theories. It applies to all of reality. There's not a distinction. The distinction is the ability to see quantum effects, and different theories explain that differently and have fancy words called decoherence and things about how quantum effects interact with the environment and dilutes them. But then other people say that's nonsense. Here's why we can't see them. But I think I can't say every, but physicists predominantly believe that quantum mechanics is not vanquished from the macro world. We're not seeing causes, we're seeing patterns of repetition and frequency and regularity, but that's not causes. And it's very convenient to see those things for all kinds of reasons, especially if you think there's free will. But they're generalizing particular situations into patterns. That's a very different thing than causes, as Hume pointed out, and as Bertrand Russell pointed out, and a lot of other people. Even Kant, in his own way, pointed out that causation isn't out there in the world. It's not a mechanical thing out there. It's a thing that involves the structure of the mind and stuff out there from sense data. But it's not that object bangs that object, bangs that object. If you're a Kantian, not
Let me
exactly
ask
right.
you a much more fundamental question about your own worldview. Do you believe that there are actual objects? Or are
Yes.
you one of those that
Well,
thinks that we're just
it-
seeing quantum particles,
Mhm.
that we've just evolved to
Mhm.
recognize particular patterns in the quantum particles because that's what helps us to survive?
No, and in a general abstract sense, I think they're particles. I'm sorry, I think they're particles. Well, that too, if you're determinist, you don't even know if there's particles, by the way. Yeah, I believe that there's objects. I believe there's something we're interacting with, and that's the mystery of the whole thing, is what's interacting with it. Is what is interacting with particles other particles, or is there something else? And if you're a determinist, you're secretly a free will advocate claiming there's something else, because you're claiming to believe that something is true and that we have the capacity to investigate and make judgments and find out what's true. Another way of saying what I've said in the book is that all determinists are secret free will advocates. Because again, the premises of science and the premises of making a determined statement is that there's truth, which is not the case if we live in a determined world. It precludes truth. So I don't buy into that. You're asking a worldview. I don't buy into that worldview. I think it's absolutely unsupportable conceptually or scientifically or logically. And we don't understand reality in so many fundamental ways. But I think that the evidence suggests that something else is going on besides materiality, which includes significance and meaning and sense and purpose and telos and all that kind of stuff that doesn't come from electrical signals and cells. It seems to be a real part of reality, and far more justifiable than you know, this likely fictive story about causal connections between things and events.
Have you
So
run
my worldview in a nutshell is that's all nonsense until there's compelling proof that it's the case, and it's logically contradictory and can't be the case in any case.
the deterministic worldview, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the view that, and when I say determinism, I mean any kind of framework for looking at reality that surrenders control over our thoughts to an outside force. It could be an evil genius, it could be God, it could be a delusion, it could be, you know, secret chemical substances snuck into our cereal every day, or our natural apple juice, natural. You know, it doesn't have to be causes. It could be random, actually. It could be random. But then random events would be making me say that it's all random events, which is contradictory. So a lot of the time I make clear in the book that I'm using determinism not just in the scientific sense, but in any surrendering authority of truth, or that there's some anything that denies as a fundamental axiom that there's truth has got a problem, because it's telling you what's true. That's my worldview. It doesn't mean that there's free will, but it certainly means that there's something else going on besides causation. There's another game being played that's more fundamental than causation. We don't know what it is yet. There may be, ultimately, I speculate at the end of the book in the new version, that there's just another type of relationship between things or events or what have you, assuming you can define those, that you cannot describe in causal terms, that you can't describe in novel terms or in free will terms. There's just other connections involved, and we see evidence of it because nobody can explain entanglement by anything physical. It just defies explanation. So there's evidence that there's relationships, mysterious relationships, what Einstein famously called spooky action at a distance, that doesn't involve causation. So there's another game being played, is my worldview. We don't understand it. We don't know what it is, but there's overwhelming evidence that the causal worldview is wrong or incomplete, based on premises that have never been addressed or proved. I won't say never been, but are rarely addressed. You don't hear a determinist talking about causation. He just launches into why we don't have free will, and he'll live it. These neural signals in Libet show we don't have free will when they don't show anything like that.
Well, it sounds like at the base of things, at the foundation of things, you do believe that truth exists.
I do, depending
Okay.
on how you define it. I mean, there's a
Okay.
lot of.
So have you run into the work of Nima Arkani-Hamed, who is a fairly well-known particle physicist?
And by the way, I'm allowed to make a statement that truth exists, because I think that there's truth behind it that allows me to make the statement.
Yes.
Like the opposite of determinism. No, I'm not familiar with that person.
Well, if you have the time, there's a lecture of his that I think you would find very fascinating. You can probably get most of it if you just even watch the first 30 minutes. It's a lecture that he did maybe five years ago or something, that he probably wishes wasn't online. I don't know, because it's very, very honest for a physicist to talk about. But he's talking about that there is a fundamental morality inside of physics, and that is the search for truth. And
yes, that's one of those
exists.
axioms that science cannot prove by science.
Right. And so he makes a very compelling argument there, and I think you might find it quite useful.
It's a version of the view from nowhere argument. As if you can't account for where meaning and significance come from in terms of physicality, it's what science is bringing to the equation that's the foundation on which they're saying there are X number of particles in the standard model, and fermions behave this way and bosons behave this way, and blah, blah, blah. And it's all based on our ability to know what's true, and the fact that things are true, and that there's regularity of patterns and all kinds of axioms that science has to assume. And it all comes down to meaning and significance. It doesn't come from robots. It doesn't come from rocks. In some weird way. And I know you have a podcast on emergence, which I listened to a bit of last night. And that's an interesting part of the whole free will equation. And I go into it a little bit as some alternative ways of thinking about the possibility of free will.
Someone else that I wanted to bring into your radar, have you run into the work of Carlo Rovelli, who has an idea of physics that it's all relationships all the way down?
Yeah, I mean, I maybe I gave the wrong impression. I think the majority of physicists are physicalists, and as I see them roll out in the new media, but there are many that I think the minority, but there are physicists who believe in free will. Roger Penrose has got his own theories about all of that and how it's possible based on cellular activity. He may or may not be right. Some thinks his theories are kind of far out there or kooky or what have you. But the point being that he's a Nobel-winning physicist who's groundbreaking things in all kinds of areas of physics, more than a half dozen, really seminal stuff that shaped modern physics. He believes in free will and he's trying to explain physically how it comes about. So there are those. I don't mean to suggest that all physicists are determinists. Well,
right. And I know the point of your book is not to prove that free will exists, right? The point of your book is just to say there are open questions here, and that we shouldn't confine ourselves to, let's say, we shouldn't say the science is settled.
Oh, the science is so unsettled, it's a joke. I mean, if you read Harris's short chapter in a short book, and I'm giving due regard for that, I'm not saying it as a criticism, he cites 3 cases, and none of the authors of the cases conclude that we're determined, or that prior neural impulses determine our decisions. One of them did in an earlier study, and then he reversed himself. That was Levin. But all three of the authors conclude that nothing in their tests prove that there's a causal relationship between these signals and our decisions. One of them found a 60% correlation. And he said, look, that's barely above chance. This is a test that free will cited for the proposition that we're neurally determined, or that it's hard to square free will with these tests. Well, these tests say that that they're not evidence that we're determined. All three of them, or all three authors, if you say one of them amended his earlier opinions that we were determined. And actually, that wasn't even the case. If you look at the actual, what he really said in the first study, he didn't exactly say that. He said that the brain's part of initiating, or part of the process of decision making. He didn't say the brain makes the decision, which is what Harris claims. In any case, go back to your point that science isn't, science proves that we're not determined by the neural signals discussed in the science. And the conclusions of the test don't, of any of them, say otherwise. Why do I say any of them? There are the determinist zealots who take correlations to be causation, who think that 70% or 80% of the time this follows this as a cause. Well, it's not a cause. It can't be a cause. Why is it not occurring 20% of the rest of the time under same conditions? It's not a cause. It's a correlation. The relationship is absolutely unclear. A correlation is just saying they happen to coincide on a regular basis. It has nothing to do with causality. So the science is actually pretty settled. It's if you look at it soberly, and I spent a lot of time looking at those tests and dissecting them, more time than I would have liked. They don't say what Harris says, and he cites three tests of dozens that have disagreeing points of view, but no one's jumping and declaring in the headlines that we don't have free will. That's actually not true what I just said. They do that, and there have been those articles, and you know what? They don't read the tests.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. I mean, other scientists talk about this quite a bit, how so many of these articles get out there, they're misrepresented by the media in a certain way. It's never changed, and no one ever reads the article, and all they know is what the media says.
They're misrepresented by the scientists who do them. I mean, they need to have their, they need to say this is natural. My apple is natural. This shows that we don't have free will. It doesn't show anything of the kind. I mean, most credible physicists, neuroscientists, make a sober conclusion at the end, that you can't draw any hard and fast conclusions. It may be some evidence of correlations that maybe at some point in completely different results might somehow turn into causation, but that's not what the tests show.
Well, we're
I was looking at one last night, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, we're limited by our history, because things that were absolutely scientifically true 100 years ago are complete nonsense now, and things that are absolutely scientifically true now are going to be complete nonsense 100 years from now. So
that goes back to something about motivation that you said. Why are they motivated? I think part of it is it is control. I don't mean control of others, but in control of it. It provides our frameworks provide comfort to ourselves, and when our facts line up with our framework, or we interpret the facts to fit within our framework, it gives order and comfort. And in Peterson's thing, it's controlling the chaos, or it gives us a sense that we're controlling, the chaos with order. And I think there's a big psychological need to do that on everybody's behalf. Confirmation bias is talked a lot about these days. It's that thing. Why? There's comfort behind it. There's also narrow-mindedness too, perhaps, but there's also comfort. We understand things. We're in control of things. So I'm curious. We're lions and the enemy camp is over there. That gives us comfort from not knowing where the enemy is.
Mike, I'm curious about your t-shirt. Would you like to, before we wrap up today, would you like to tell us about your t-shirt?
Not really. There's a company that puts all kinds of crazy, nonsensical logos on t-shirts, and I never liked to send messages on t-shirts. So I went to that company because they're nonsense. But then, of course, based on everything we've been talking about, people will put meanings on it, right? And they will
Yeah.
put it in their framework.
That's
It's
okay.
sort
I
of
mean,
got
I
a
can just see
Grateful
enough of it.
Dead-ish
It's
sense to
death
it.
rides
It's
what?
Death Riders. It's got I'll interpret it in a Grateful Dead sense, but I have no idea what it means.
Is there an image on there, or is it just the text?
There's an image of a skull. And
Oh, okay.
beneath the skull, it says, I don't know what it says. It's just it's a made up, this company makes up logos and slogans that sort of look like they're real and they're not. I mean, I could do a real one. I mean, we could do a determinist t-shirts. What I'm saying is compelled by causal forces. or yours. It's true there's no truth. Or it's true that determinism is true. I would wear that t-shirt. And how about Libet was right, and I'm neurally determined to believe it. This is a very, very interesting aspect when I stumbled onto the performative contradiction. Very few people talk about it, and it's super important. It's a fundamental way to discredit determinism. Determinists don't talk about it. Determinists don't talk about it.
Well, since I only got through half the book, maybe you could come back after I finish the second half and we could talk about performative contradictions and a couple of other things if you have the time. Maybe by that time your new version will be out.
Yeah, I think it will. Probabilistically speaking, the wave function will hopefully have collapsed and manifested in observable ways that we can apply Newtonian physics to. Yeah, probably a couple of weeks, and I'm happy to send you a copy.
Oh, you don't need to do that unless you want to. I mean, it will probably take me at least the next several weeks to finish the second half of the book, because I also read very carefully when I'm trying to understand something that has a lot of moving parts. Let's put it that way.
I think there's some more sophisticated observations in the new one that you should wait for. It's just the longer I think about a subject, the more things pop into my brain.
Well, anyway, I'm really enjoying the book. I highly recommend it. But David says wait until the new edition comes out. So
the cover will be a little different, by the way. The cover will be more like what's behind me. You can't see all of it, but it'll be a little bit more like that.
Yep, I see the robot. Yeah, it is completely different than this other robot.
Well, it's very thematic, so you wouldn't notice it.
This
In any
robot,
case,
I got to show people this picture though. This is pretty funny. There's a sink and a toothbrush, and the robot is brushing his teeth. Is there a symbolism in that?
well, the reader or the person looking at the cover is supposed to be the one who's reflected in the.
I see.
Cover.
Okay, yeah.
And before I decided to change the cover, I had the artist, who's terrific, actually add a thumb on the toothbrush so it would give more context that you were in your own bathroom and looking at that. And some people immediately get it and some people don't. And that's partly why I changed it, but I thought it was wonderful art.
Yeah, it's a very compelling idea. Well, like I said, we just barely scratched the surface today. So if you want to come back sometime, that'd be great.
Be happy to. It was fun.
I'm just worried about your kitty. You said you have to take your kitty to the vet.
Yeah. I have a dog and a cat that have something to be worried about, some medical attention now. Yeah.
Well, best of luck at the vet. And
now we're in the biochemical side of life.
Yeah.
Fortunately.
Yeah. And even they have free will to a certain extent.
I don't see how it's possible that we don't, but I also can't concede that it's been proven in any fundamental, definitive way. And again, I have this just suspicion that the answer is more creative than anything we can think of right now.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I've certainly stumbled across that in a lot of things that I've stumbled across in the last few years. So maybe we can talk about that on a future episode. This has been great, David. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It was nice to meet you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.